Hi, BookTube. Welcome to a nonfiction vlog. We're starting a series of vlogs with this one because a series is needed to fully appreciate this sizable work of English social history. So we are beginning to take a look at Religion and the Decline of Magic by Keith Thomas, published in 1971. 853 pages. Yep, you read it right, of which 800 are the text. Now, this is a surprisingly inexpensive book to get a hold of, considering that it remains the defining work covering this subject matter. You can, if you're in the UK right now and you have a Kindle, the Kindle version of this book is selling for £1.99. And so I bought a copy because I thought, hey, yeah, I may have the paperback, but when you have a book that is this thick and this information dense, you do want the ability to search it. We'll talk about the author, Sir Keith Thomas, because he was knighted in 1988 for his services to history. He was born in 1933 in the Vale of Glamorgan in Wales. He went to a state-funded grammar school, so he didn't come from a wealthy background, but he won a scholarship to attend Oxford University and got his qualification in history. Religion, the Decline of Magic was his first publication for a non-academic audience, and of course he continued to teach at the university as well, so he had one other publication which again covered similar territory. You will find in my description box a link to a YouTube video, not very good quality, but I think it was recorded more for sentimental purposes because it marked the 50th birthday of the book and Keith Thomas being congratulated by his colleagues at the university. Okay, just so you know what we're going to do and how we're going to tackle things, I put a little schedule on screen here. This is how I divided up my reading, because this book is it's not a narrative history. What do I mean by that? Some works of history are written such that they don't feel like a novel. That would be a little too close, but they move in a narrative fashion and they present information in a way that seems to allow this narrative structure to keep moving forward easily. So they tend to be easier to read, and you often can retain the information more easily. With Keith Thomas, the subject matter, it doesn't really lend itself to narration. This is a survey of behavior over a couple of centuries, and so the text is going to feel like reading an inventory of all the facts that Thomas had to collect in order to prove his assertions, because there weren't any statistics for the period, and we're talking about from the beginning of the reign of the Tudors to the English Civil War and maybe a decade or two thereafter. That's our main period of time. The record keeping for this period of time is iffy. And obviously to prove a point, what Thomas has to do is get as many sources as he can, which are as close to the time as possible, making statements about how people behaved or how they thought. So I wanted time to read this book. I made an attempt to read it back when I first bought it, which I think was in the late 1990s, and I didn't get all the way through. And I think that's because I simply tried to tackle the whole thing in one go, try to read it within the time I might take to read two 400-page books, 400-page novels, but that's not the same thing. So I felt that my better strategy would be to divide this book up into chunks that I felt were easy to read slowly. So we're covering about 130 pages each month, and so that's what I'm going to vlog about. Today we're just going to cover the first 133 pages, which is roughly, I believe it's the first 4 chapters of the book, and we'll talk about those in some more detail along with the foreword. But first, a little bit about the structure as a whole, again, so you can make a decision whether you want to buy this. Even if it is £1.99, it's still a hefty, what you get for £1.99 is this. You get 800 pages of text, of which there's 22 chapters, average pages per chapter 36. So beware, if you do buy a paper copy rather than an e-book copy, you will get high density text on the page. You'll get single space text, you'll get 11-point font, you will get footnotes in the text itself, not at the end of the book. And so there won't be a bibliography at the end, there won't be notes at the end. All that will be happening in the same page as the citation in the text. For that reason, again, I think the Kindle version might be better if you do need enlarged text, or if you want to really study this book and you know that you need to save down notes, you want to annotate. There's not a lot of room for annotations in the paperback versions. Maybe in the hardcover it might be different, but if you don't want to annotate a hardcover, then I say that the very cheap Kindle version is probably a fantastic way to be able to keep your notes and to search for passages for particular information that you want in the absence of, a lot of bibliography and notes at the end of the book, which are sometimes easier to move through. First, we're going to look at the foreword. Now, Keith Thomas here lays out his aims for writing the book. Why did he feel he needed to cover this period in more detail? And I'm quoting him now, where he says, astrology, witchcraft, magical healing, divination, ancient prophecies, ghosts, and fairies are now all rightly disdained by intelligent persons, but they were taken seriously by equally intelligent persons in the past, and it is the historian's business to explain why this was so. So the initial aim grew more complicated as Thomas started to gather his data. He found himself needing to define where the boundary lies between what is magic and what is religion, and how that boundary was shifting a little bit. Where were the English defining it as they entered their peculiar version of the Protestant Reformation, which was also, as it happened, a dramatic socio-political upheaval, which led to a diversity of Christianity and a different structure of government. But before we get into what the chapters contain, I want to talk about something that anyone who's read a great deal of nonfiction, you'll be very familiar with this convention. But I don't think anyone's ever discussed it and talked about how useful and how good it is that it exists. And this is the convention at the beginning of most works of good nonfiction for the author to make some kind of disclaimer about the book's shortcomings or failings. And what I mean by that is they should be stating what considerations influenced or affected what they did or didn't include in the book. And those considerations could include, and I'm going to list a number of them, the length of the manuscript, for example. Thomas himself says the nature of his approach to his subject meant that he was going to be writing a long book. He was going to be including a lot of information to back up his points. Or if the author might make a disclaimer if there's a lack of source material about the subject he's covering, just to make people aware that of what body of information he's actually got to work with. Or if there's biases in that source material that can't be helped. Again, an author may state that as well and say that and what he tried to do to overcome those biases. He also should be noting if there's any kind of focal bias. That is, does the author make some kind of conscious choice to focus on one aspect of his subject to the exclusion of other aspects, and does he have a reason for doing that? And finally, there should be some disclaimer about the critical stance. So I think any good author should make people aware if he's taking a particular critical stance, a Marxist, feminist, deconstructionist, queer, critical stance toward a subject matter. And the author doesn't do this because they think their reading audience is stupid. It's not that the reader necessarily needs a disclaimer. Sometimes really experienced readers can tell as they're reading whether the sources are good, whether the author has focused on one aspect of a subject rather than all aspects, etc. And they can certainly spot critical stance. The more experienced you get, the better you can spot that. But I think what the author wants the reader to know is that they, the author, are conscious of their limitations. It's a reminder also to readers that no single book is ever going to be the perfect source of truth on any subject. And it encourages the reader, I think, too, by saying this book has its limitations. It encourages the reader, if you want to really know this subject yourself, here are my sources, here are some other materials I went to, please go ahead and look into them, validate this question for yourself. I'm always really reassured to find these kind of disclaimers in a book. And I've got three reasons for that. One, it tells me that the author is disciplined and structured in their approach to their research. Otherwise, they couldn't know what their shortcomings are. Secondly, it's clear that they want me to question their work. They don't want me to give them some kind of guru-like status. And finally, I know that I cannot finish that book and then say that I know everything there is to know about that particular subject, because the author has already made me aware that he has fallen short. So what could I expect but something slightly less than that? And Thomas makes 6 very good points in his foreword, which are kind of advice to the reader, disclaimers, and I'm going to just run through these really quickly. Number 1, the broad scope of the subject that he chose. And you might think, oh, it's a narrow scope because he's only talking about England. He's not even expanding out to Western Europe, which was also Christian. So they must have had doing something similar in their thought patterns and the changes of ideas. Yeah, he does say that he couldn't possibly extend his study to Europe, because you can see that just by trying to capture the mental climate of early modern England by itself, so much material had to be put together that the book is very long. And yet Thomas says he still feels that in places he has compressed what he's had to write and oversimplified. So he makes a disclaimer and apology for that. Secondly, the book is arranged, he says, so that the reader doesn't have to take it from beginning to end. They can pick a chapter and they can read it in any order. He doesn't believe there's necessarily any problem in reading it any way you like. Third, he says that he picked an end date of 1700, and that he chose that because he felt it marked a significant shift in English thought about matters magical. And because of that, legal records, which he relied upon for a lot of his information, they stopped talking about things like witchcraft and divination and started focusing on other matters. And point number 4, sorry, I kind of already gave away point number 4, because he said, while points of comparison may exist outside of England, this survey took virtually all its data from English records. And when you see how much data, you will understand why he didn't even attempt to make it a European survey. And point 5, he regrets that he can't provide much statistical data, that it simply didn't exist. And so he has to back up his arguments with statements made in books, which he can't prove whether they're true or not. All he can really do is show you the quantity of similar statements made by different people around the same time period to lead you to back up the probability that there was some kind of issue like the one that all these people are commenting on. And his final point is he's responded to suggestions from friends and correspondence that since the 1971 edition came out. I was reading the 1972 edition, so he'd already made corrections and additions. And I suppose if you buy an even later copy, you might find that even more corrections and additions. So it might be worthwhile buying the latest possible copy rather than an early one, unless you would like that for the cover graphic or something. So you can see it, this video has already gotten really dense and we haven't got past the foreword. I'm going to try to keep my descriptions of what's in each of the first 4 chapters simple, because I just feel like I could quote all his examples. Some of them are very amusing, and if I do find an amusing one, I will quote from it. But otherwise, I'm going to just try to keep it simple so you can get an idea of what this book is covering. Chapter 1 begins by setting the stage, by giving you a sense of what was this place called England around the time of the Tudor monarchs and the Stuart monarchs. What were the outstanding features? If you could have time traveled back, what would you have noticed about the environment? And so I'm just going to list some of the qualities that you might have noticed had you been an observer at the time. You would have noticed that the population grew quite rapidly. We were beyond the time of great plagues. I'm not saying they didn't happen again, they did, but the medieval plagues, which took such a large toll of life, were over, and the population began to grow because of changes in agriculture. So it went from 2 million at the beginning of the Tudor period to around 5 million towards the year 1700. So a big increase. Life expectancy was still quite short. 40 years was the average. And roughly 50% of babies that were born did not survive to the age of 16, and 36% of those actually didn't get to their 6th birthday. So infant mortality was high, child mortality was high. The diet of most people was unvaried and not predictably plentiful. And so the cause of death in a lot of cases was famine. But then, of course, there was no understanding of hygiene, no medical knowledge, and so there were also a lot of preventable deaths, what would be preventable now, small injuries and infections, which then, because they weren't properly treated or people did not know how to protect their bodies from infection, caused many more premature deaths. And there were frequent fires. Fire as a cause of death would have come up very high in the top 5, because in some cases there were cities in England that burned down, or a segment of it burned down, more than once in the time period that Thomas is covering by his book. So a tough environment to live in. And so he concludes this chapter by answering the question, what were the sources of relief from all this suffering? And they make quite amusing reading. Alcohol, tobacco, which had just been brought over from the Americas in the late 1500s, early 1600s, gambling, and then lastly, superstition and or faith. And that leads nicely into chapter 2. Chapter 2 is titled The Magic of the Medieval Church. And I'm going to open up by reading a quote from page 28 of my 1972 edition, where it says, "On the eve of the Reformation, the Church did not as an institution claim the power to work miracles, but it reaped prestige from the doings of those of its members to whom God was deemed to have extended miraculous gifts." So in this chapter, what Thomas looks at is the different sources of power that could be had for the believer in England in the medieval church. Things are going to look a lot like magic, are going to seem more magical than religious to our modern sensibilities. And he talks about different things. First of all, he talks about the places in England which were believed to be imbued with magical power. These were pilgrimage sites, and there were many of them. I had no idea just how many. We know about Glastonbury and Lindisfarne, they're well known, but there were other sites like Walsingham, Westminster, St. Albans, Bury St. Edmunds, York, and Durham, which also had pilgrimage sites. And I may add Hereford, because Hereford had a pilgrimage site as well, which I was able to see. They still keep the shrine there at the church, and it is well decorated. I think it's beautiful because they've kept a sort of a wooden canopy in beautiful colors, which makes you think of what it must have been like for medieval pilgrims, apart from the fact that the stones, the statues of that are on the tombs have been obviously kissed and touched so often that their noses have worn down flat. So you know that many people have been there before. So it underlined what I had read in Thomas. And then there are other sources of power. He talks about shrines, about holy images or icons, relics, talismans, little sources of power that people could wear on their person. And the church's own materials for worship acquired a superstitious status, particularly holy water or the Eucharist wafer. And Thomas quotes many examples of people misusing those two things, but it shows the level of belief that these objects, which were part of worship, could extend power outside of the ritual for which they were intended. And I will read, in fact, an anecdote on page 33 about a particular widow using holy water to defend her reputation when she's accused of being a witch. This comes from page 33. Just let me get over there. The devil, it was agreed, was allergic to holy water, and whenever his influence was suspected, it was an appropriate remedy. In the reign of Elizabeth I, Widow Wiseman, who was later a Catholic martyr, threw holy water at her persecutor Topcliffe, whose horse thereupon flung him to the ground. Topcliffe raged against her, calling her an old witch, who by her charms had made his horse to lay him on the ground, but, and this is related by a Catholic source, The widow, with good reason, laughed to see that holy water had given Topcliffe so fine a fall. Here, as Protestant commentators were to urge, the distinction between magic and religion was an impossibly fine one. Yes, it was. And I think this is what the whole focus of this chapter was. It was very difficult to draw a line between magic and religion in the pre-Reformation English Church. So naturally, chapter 3 goes on to talk about, once the Reformation started, what did various church leaders do to try to correct this situation. And they started by beginning to define magic as using any practice which was aimed to gain control over natural phenomenon, whereas religion was seen slightly differently. Religion was making requests to the maker of natural phenomenon and asking if he might intervene if it was his will. That these were the two different things, but no control over those things. Thomas, of course, goes on to show that this definition meant a lot of people started to challenge even Christian sacraments like baptism or the Eucharist or the consecration of churches, because really, weren't you performing a bit of magic to change unconsecrated ground into consecrated ground? Weren't you therefore changing a natural phenomenon by the use of some words and the sprinkling of water and so on? It was a very difficult argument when the English Church, of course, because they still wanted to uphold the structure of sacraments. But magic would include practices like creating a talisman or even the transubstantiation of the Eucharist host. I think this was a big point among Protestants, was the transformation of the bread and the wine taken at Holy Communion, that to suggest that changed and became something divine, actually divine. They felt that crossed over into the territory of magic. But again, that didn't stop them from continuing with things like consecrating church ground, having the Eucharist, having baptism, and so on. So it's interesting because prayer was perhaps the chief tool where Protestants wanted to make a distinction there even between what could be considered magical prayer, that is, prayers that were repeated, prayers that were just going through a ritual motion of repeating phrases rather than actually having a conversation with your Creator to ask for whatever intercession you wish to ask for. All these little aspects, and it's fascinating because there are practices which no longer happen, or they happen as folk tradition now in England, and we've kind of forgotten what their connection is. Things like processions, wakes, Shrove Tuesday, and Saints' Days. They're still recognized or known in England, but not always understood where they came from or what they might have meant to medieval Christians. But there are also obscure practices which were ended during the Protestant Reformation in England because they were felt to be too magical. Things like collections for plough lights and hobby horses. I don't know why a hobby horse was got rid of, because that was really just a toy with which a child was allowed to practice the idea of riding a horse, of being on horseback. But there must have been something else to it. Again, there were a lot of things he doesn't have time to comment upon. I'm sure he would have liked to. But the key question that Thomas asks at the end of chapter 3 is all this reform and all this getting rid of things that were considered magical. Remember the prologue and all the description of how tough life was at that time in England. What did Protestantism have to offer ordinary people as a source of relief if they could not resort to these magical practices? So Thomas now begins a series of chapters, and we'll only look at one, where he shows what Protestantism had to offer in place of medieval superstition and magical type of practices. And he starts out with the concept in chapter 4 of providence. And that is, he makes the claim that all post-Reformation theologians taught that nothing could happen in the world without God's permission. Now, this was a difference from, for example, the early church father Thomas Aquinas, who did not believe that divine providence necessarily eliminated the operation of chance or luck. So the chapter starts to consider, okay, if you take this position that everything in the world happens because it's a choice of God, then you get some other questions. The first line of thought that you come to is, does God operate within nature all the time, or does he operate above it? Does he do a bit of both? English Protestants, Thomas says, and he quotes a lot of examples, were inclined to believe that God did all his operating within natural law. And I think that was to kind of underline that discouragement of seeking magical or superstitious practices, which tended to lean toward the idea that you could subvert natural law, you could somehow get round it, or get something with power to work outside natural law to work for you. To suggest that God worked within natural law was also a natural springboard and encouragement to scientific research and the scientific method. And I'm reading here from page 92 of Thomas's book, where he says, God's sovereignty was thought to be exercised through regular channels, and the natural world was fully susceptible of study by scientists seeking causes and regularities. So you can see then how the English Reformation naturally lent itself to and encouraged scientific research, encouraged it because scientific research became the way to know God, because you needed to know the world that he made, since he was operating within it and making decisions about every aspect of it within the laws that he had set. But going back to the questions that a providential philosophy poses, there is this other line of thought. If God manages everything, then what did it mean if something good or something bad happened to a particular person? And most of this chapter, I would say, is taken up with examples of writing from the 16th and 17th century, either contemplating this question or, more likely, collecting anecdotal examples of bad behavior being punished with misfortune or good behavior being rewarded with good fortune. The third line of thought, which comes from accepting this idea of divine providence entering into every single operation of the natural world, was that it made you, as an individual, realize that God must be extremely interested in you as an individual, along with all these other individuals, because he's coming down to a micromanagement level of your everyday life as well as everyone else's. And the sense of being God's special preoccupation, I think, is a particularly Protestant one. And Thomas, I think, then also gets to the root of Western individualism. Western individualism becomes an outgrowth of providence. If God is in charge of every single little thing that happens in your life, well, he must be that interested in you. How could he not be? However, one drawback, and this is the fourth line of thought. If God is so heavily involved in everything that happens in the natural world, including everything that happens in an individual Christian's life, how much of your own effort should be made, therefore, to prevent misfortune? Oh, here Thomas, he makes this rare jump forward into the 19th century, because the 19th century, there was a brief revival of the conviction about providence in the evangelical churches of the early 19th centuries, the Bulstrodes, if you will. And he's talking about Jenner's cowpox inoculation and the furor which was caused when it became required by law to be inoculated. I'm going to read now from page 129 of the book. The 91st Psalm continued to be cited, this is in the 19th century, to prove that the godly would not be touched by epidemics, and smallpox inoculation was seen by some as a doubting of providence. So there you can see that idea of providence being carried through from the 16th and 17th centuries into the 19th century revival of Protestantism to infect even a scientific development, a medical development. I just found that interesting, how that line of thought, unfortunately, it can lead to a lot of interesting but incorrect conclusions about how a human being should operate in the world. And what I've given you in this first vlog is really just a taster. This book is dense with examples, some amusing, some just, you just didn't realize that that's how it was at the time. And so I'm finding it fascinating reading. And I think if this is already a subject area that you take an interest in, that is religion or theology, the Protestant Reformation in general, this book is a fascinating insight and could be a stepping stone for understanding perhaps how similar ideas or different ideas developed in different parts of Europe and in North America. And I'll probably comment on that more because one thing that Thomas hasn't remarked upon yet was the socioeconomic status of most Puritans, or those who chose unconventional religion rather than remain in the Church of England. Because the lower classes, one thing that Thomas makes very clear, and I'll talk about this more in the second vlog, is how little interest the poor of England, which would have been the majority of the population, how little interest they took in religion, how little they really knew about Christianity. That was the chapter, that was the reason I bought the book. So look out for the next vlog, because that's going to be, if that isn't eye-opening, then you know more than me. Okay, I guess that's not really such a big deal because probably a lot of people do. Anyway, if that is sounding at all interesting, then join me again next month for my second vlog on Thomas's religion and magic. Take care. Bye-bye.